And so just a little briefing for those of you who may have wandered in here and don't know. David wrote some of the most impactful reporting in the 2016 election. We were really proud of tracking Trump's charity donations, as well as, of course, the sort of famous or infamous Access Hollywood tape, for which he won the 2017 National Reporting Pulitzer Prize. He continues to do a lot of work on the same area, most recently breaking a lot of stories about Trump's charities and fundraising galas that are going on at Mar-a-Lago and his different properties. So today's session, we'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end. We have 2 mics up here. But first, we kind of wanted to just have a discussion about how do you actually do reporting in this age? What is your tactic? I think, we'll get into this too, a little bit more about how you've built a community, and I think that's so impressive. And so why don't you just kind of talk about how you've approached this whole thing? How did you stumble into it? What happened?
I completely stumbled into it. My original assignment in the 2016 campaign was to write about basically weirdo loser candidates. So I wanted to write about candidates that you could get really close to, people you could really sort of get to know, not candidates that you had to be in a crowd of hundreds of reporters. So I was writing about Bobby Jindal, Rick Perry, Mike Huckabee, Rick Santorum, people that you forgot even ran for president in this last time around. So then they all lost, or they all dropped out. And so I ended up in the beginning of February 2016 without really any candidates to cover because all my losers were gone. And they sent me to Iowa to see Trump. And I just happened to, the day I was there, he did this weird rally in Waterloo, Iowa, where he held up in the middle of a rally. He sort of stopped the rally itself. He held up this big check that was for $100,000. It said Donald J. Trump Foundation on top of it. Gave the big check and then later a real check to the veterans group that was in the crowd. And then the rally resumed. And I thought, well, that's weird. I've never seen anybody give away a donation in a rally before. And it got me started in trying to figure out what that money was, where it came from, and then when I learned it was part of a bigger pot of money he'd raised, where the rest of it had gone. I just sort of blundered into that. It turned out I had blundered into a story that Trump responded to in a way that was very typical of Trump and still is, which was to stonewall and not give any information. People think Donald Trump is a guy who's totally transparent. There's a lot of things that, at least he was during the campaign, there's a lot of things he thinks he can kill the story by just not telling you anything about it. And so I had sort of stumbled on an area where to report about Donald Trump, you had to talk to a million other people about their interactions with him. So I didn't mean to get into that, but once I got into it, I found it was fascinating and just sort of kept digging.
That's crazy. It's like a moment in time. So, you talked about kind of the stonewalling piece of it, right? So how is your prep go? Where do you know how to begin digging into this? Are you going into old records? Are you starting to call around the circle? How does that work?
Well, the thing that was really useful for me, useful training, was that I had spent a couple years writing about government bureaucracy before I started covering Trump. And about I wanted to find the most stupid and wasteful examples of government bureaucracy and then try to trace their origins back. Why do we have a national raisin reserve? Why is there why does the U.S. Department of Education Department of Agriculture require magicians to write disaster plans to save the rabbits they pull out of their hats? How do these things happen? And so a lot of times I was dealing, this was in 2013 and 2014, I was dealing with agencies that really did not want to tell me why about this stupid thing they were doing, about the National Raisin Reserve or whatever. That's a real thing, by the way, or at least it was. So you had to find ways around, the front door didn't open. And I think they were accustomed to the idea that if they told you, no, we're not going to tell you anything about this subject you want to find out about, that you'll just go away. And so for me, that was a great training in doing what I had been taught to do as a young reporter, to draw concentric circles around the thing that I was trying to write about and start in the outside circle and work in. One great example of that on the bureaucracy beat was I found out about this thing in Pennsylvania. This sounds like the kind of thing that the government couldn't hide, but it had hid it for a long time. Underneath the ground in Slippery Rock, Pennsylvania, there's a giant cavern. It's an old limestone mine. And the government puts all of its employees' paperwork, personnel files, in file cabinets in the mine. And then employs people to work in the mine underground, sorting paper all day long, so that if somebody retires from the federal government, they sort of go into the giant mine cavern, get their paperwork, and process their retirement. The process there takes 70 days. It took as long to process one retirement case as it had in the 1970s. And I was like, okay, paperwork dungeon? I'm really interested in it. I want to find out more about this paperwork dungeon. And the OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, who ran that mine, said, no, you can't come in the mine. We won't tell you anything about it. There's social security numbers scattered everywhere. You can't come in. It would be a security risk. And so I think they thought they'd killed it. But in fact, I could go and find, through LinkedIn, find somebody who used to work in the mine and now has left and talk to him about what that experience was like. And then who else does he know that was in the mine and left? So you're working around the subject to where at the end, I went back to Office of Personnel Management and said, look, let me on the mine or not. I can tell you everything that happens in the mine. I know, where Bob sits and where Susie sits. I know why it takes so long. I know the whole process. I could draw you a map of what it looks like. So I'm going to write the story. You can choose whether you want to be in it or not. If you want to be in the story telling your side of it, you can, but I don't need, I don't need you to write the story. And they, in that case, said, okay, fine, come look at the mine, but don't bring a photographer. You can only, we had we got a tour of the mine because of that. And Trump was so much like that. His saying, look, I give lots of money to charity, but I'm not going to tell you anything about who I give it to or when or how. Just trust me that I've given millions to charity. That was sort of the same sort of challenge. Okay, if that's true, there are people out there who know the details of it, and it's just a matter of finding them.
And so how did you go about finding them?
Well, the two ways, basically. There was one way, there was sort of an obvious template of people that might have been the recipients of Trump's money. So the Donald J. Trump Foundation, this sort of small charity he'd started in the 80s, the IRS requires them to publish the people they give donations to. The Trump Foundation would publish their donors. And so they were a good list to call and say, A, why did the Donald J. Trump Foundation give you money? And in some cases, the answer was, well, because he bought a $20,000 portrait of himself and paid for it with his charity's money. And also to ask them, has Trump given any money out of his own pocket? Has he only given this from this foundation that has other people's money in it? So that was a template. And then there were some places, though, where I just didn't know even where to start. And I sort of bumbled into the idea of using Twitter as a way of as a way of reporting rather than just sort of broadcasting what I'd written, because I ran up against a problem where none of my reporting training had given me a way to start looking for the thing I wanted to find. Okay, so in May of last year, Corey Lewandowski, who was Trump's campaign manager at the time, told me Donald Trump, months earlier, had promised to give $1 million out of his own pocket to veterans. And I couldn't find any evidence that had actually happened. And Lewandowski called me, as I said, 4 months later and said, okay, Donald Trump has given that money away. Trust me on that, but I can't tell you who got the money or in what amounts or when. Everything is secret beyond the fact that I'm telling you it's definitely all been spent. So, I mean, this is a room full of journalists. We wrote a story saying that he said that, but you can't just let that be the final word. So, but then I was trying to figure out, okay, what's the next step? I want to find the people who got the money, but I don't even know where to start calling. There's thousands of veterans charities in the United States. So that's when I started on Twitter. So basically as a way to broadcast what I was looking for. So I tweeted at Disabled American Veterans, Veterans of Foreign Wars, veterans magazines, all kinds of organizations that I thought would have a network of veterans and veterans charities saying, spread this query far and wide. I'm just looking for anybody who got even $100, even $1 of this $1 million that Trump gave away. If you got it, let me know. And that, in that case, it didn't work as I expected. The query was spread out far and wide. A lot of people got back to me to say that no, they hadn't gotten any money. But because I had tagged Trump's name, and obviously we know he searches for his own name, I put his name in my queries. After the day of my searching and not finding anything and sort of making a public spectacle of the fact that I was trying to find proof of his giving and couldn't find it, then he gave the money away. So all that time earlier, it was still in his pocket. The money was still unspent. He was hoping, I think, that we wouldn't put any pressure on him. We would just take his word for it. After I spent a day searching for it, then he gave the money away. And that's when I said, wow, okay, Twitter can be a way to reach new people that I didn't know that didn't know of their existence before today, but also it's a way to make someone's lack of response into the story. Instead of slamming the door shut on the story, the fact that they won't answer me can become the story itself and can put pressure on them to be truthful.
So I think you definitely use social media in such an interesting and particularly helpful way, especially when you were asking people to find the Trump photos at Mar-a-Lago,
right.
And they were going into clubs and finding these pictures for you. But I think also something that you do that's really innovative and benefits, I think, your journalism is you also are creating a really big community around what you do, which who knew there was such a big general audience for following charity money
right.
around. Can you talk about a little bit how you think about programming and, leading people on and letting people understand kind of like, hey, this is a big deal?
Well, so what I'm about to say is probably going to seem like completely old news to the people in the crowd. This is a new discovery to me, like an old print journalist. This has probably been obvious to many of you for years. But the thing that I found last year was that there was so much news going on. There were so many things distracting my readers, so many things distracting me, that the old model, the way I would have covered this story, which is to let's write a story and then put it online, and then at some indeterminate time in the future, I'll write another story saying what I know then. But if you're a reader who sort of tunes in the middle, and you are interested in this topic, you'll find my old story with no indication that I'm still following it or that there's anything more to be said. So I wanted to give people kind of a thread to follow. I wanted to give people a way to follow what I was doing every day, even if there was not a story that I'd written that day or a web story. Let's let them know what I'm doing every single day, and let them sort of see the hunt. I mean, people they make movies about reporters. It's not every job they make movies about, and most of the movies are totally wrong. But they make movies about us because there's a chase, there's a hunt.
So who's going to play you in the movie?
I will accept only The Rock.
Okay. Good choice. The similarities,
uncanny. That's what people say.
Yeah.
But people liked, in this case, this is like the most mundane sort of hunt or chase you could imagine. I mean, I'm not solving a murder. I'm not I'm trying to find evidence that Donald Trump gave money to charity. But people liked seeing every day the mystery unfold a little bit. They like being able to participate in it, but they like seeing it every day. So for me, that meant writing stories as often as I could, but using this notebook, taking pictures of my notebook as the list expanded, as my search expanded, so people could see, in your social media feed, there's nothing that looks like that. There's nothing that looks like a guy scribbling on a notebook. And so every time you see it, you're reminded of me and what I'm doing. Oh yeah, it's the notebook guy. I remember what he's doing. And every time that a little story would pop up in this reporting, we figured out that Trump had used $12,000 of his charity's money to buy a Tim Tebow signed Broncos helmet. That's a funny story because it shows you that Trump's vaunted ability to make great investments was definitely not in evidence. He bought that helmet as Tim Tebow was getting massacred by the Patriots in the playoffs, and so he paid $12,000 for a signed Tebow helmet that now is worth $200. So when we discovered that he bought this helmet with charity money, okay, well, I'm going to write that story. When I post it, I'm going to post it with the notebook page that shows the charity I'm talking about, so that I tie in. Here's the thing that I'm writing about today, but here's a way to understand it in the context of what's come before. So to try to do things to let people sort of catch up to the story that I was doing, and also to make sure they didn't lose the thread because there was something happening every day that they could sort of watch and participate in.
I mean, I definitely think that's something on our side of sort of digital product we deal a lot with, was just how do you come into the middle of a big story and start to understand the full range of it? I mean, I think, so you're doing a lot of this reporting, and ultimately this sort of leads you to a big interview, right? Or the phone call, or something that's going to confirm a lot of it. Can you talk about how do you prepare for that? What have you found is really important? I think we all see a lot of interviews, people will try to get a lot past you. How do you make sure that those 5 minutes that you get are really worth it?
So, I mean, I'll put this in the Trump context. Trump's way of dealing with the fact that his way of dealing with reporters is often to make himself the only arbiter of facts about himself, right? He tries to keep all the real details of his business or anything else as secret as possible. So when you come to him and ask, in the old days it was, what percentage ownership do you have in this building? What's happening with Miss Universe? Is Trump University a scam? He wants to make himself the only person who really knows. And so if he tells you A today and the opposite of A tomorrow, there's no objective truth to compare it up against. And so interviewing Trump in that way is always hard because he wants to make himself the only person who could tell you about himself. He'll often say, even now that he's president, well, don't listen to my advisors, just listen to me. And then they often say, don't listen to him at all. He's just the president, you don't pay attention. So for Trump, for me, the key to interviewing him, he's an extreme case, but I found this last year, I came into these interviews with him knowing more than he did, or at least as much as he did about what he'd done. And the same with his spokespeople. I had the privilege of being immersed in the subject that they were calling about. So they would often call with no warning at all. 90% of the time, 95% of the time.
So you're doing all these interviews on the phone?
Yes. I haven't seen Trump in person since 2012 in another campaign context. But no, I haven't met him in person in a long time. It was all on the phone, and it was all a surprise. Like what I told you.
So he just randomly calls your desk?
Well, he did once. Never again. So I told you about how he had promised to give the money away to veterans, $1 million, and it turned out he hadn't. After my sort of spectacle of searching for the money, he finally does give the money away, and then out of the blue, he called me. And I didn't know this was happening. I didn't know to expect it. And so, okay, I say, well, the point of the backstory was that I was prepared. I knew the subject of what he was going to talk about at least as well as he did, and I had sources about him that were not him.
So does he just personally call you, or is it like, please hold for Mr. Trump?
I think somebody said, please hold for the president, for Donald Trump.
I also think it's impressive that you answer your desk phone.
Yeah.
It's an old school landline.
Yeah. So Trump called and he said, okay, I've given the money away. And the group was this group called the Marine Corps Law Enforcement Foundation. It's run by a friend of his who's a retired FBI agent. He gave all $1 million like that night to this one group. And I said, well, why did it take you so long? You promised this money 4 months ago. Why did it take you so long? And he said, oh, I had to vet the group. I had to vet this group to be sure they were worthy of the money. And that was when it was helpful to have really immersed myself in this topic already, because I had already called that group for doing other research about Trump's charitable giving, because he'd given them some money in the past. The group had given Donald Trump a Man of the Year award the year before, the Waldorf Astoria. They had a whole gala that dedicated to just showing what a great guy Donald Trump was, and giving them this plaque that was like the size of the size of a small table. So I knew that because I'd been digging into the subject, and I don't think Trump expected me to know that. And so I said, they gave you a Man of the Year award last year. They had a whole thing at the Waldorf Astoria. After that, you had to vet them still? And he was like, oh, yeah, you're right. And then I said, well, did you just give this money away because I was asking about it? And he called me a nasty guy, refused to answer the question. It was a really interesting interview, unlike any interview I've ever had, because, sometimes in an interview like that where people are attacking you, you can feel like nervous, you can feel flustered, you want to fight back. I felt like I'd had so much training, and those of you who dealt with the Obama administration know this, I had so much training being yelled at by them that I was used to being yelled at by people on the phone, and this actually was kind of amateur yelling. So Trump would say, like, oh, you're a nasty guy, you should be ashamed of yourself, and what? I'm not going to argue with him about whether I'm a nasty person or not. So,
to be clear, you're also known as one of the best colleagues, I think, in the newsroom.
Well, thank you. But the point is that, like, I wanted to talk about facts. He had gotten a bunch of other people's money in. Other people had given him money to give to the veterans, and I didn't know what had happened to it yet. So I'm like, okay, fine, I'm a nasty person. What about this other $3.2 million you were supposed to give to veterans? Other people's money. And then he would sort of reset. Like, he wanted to fight, but if I wasn't going to fight, then he would sort of reset and be like, well, okay, he'd answer that question sort of, I don't know if I wouldn't call it factually, but he would answer the question. And then that sort of question would devolve into insults again. You should be ashamed of yourself. You're such a nasty person. And then I would just ask another factual question. He would sort of reset. It was a really strange interview. But the other time when this sort of came in handy, having been immersed in this topic, was Boris Epstein, who is now a journalist, a contributor to Sinclair Broadcasting, one of Trump's spokespeople at the time. There was this one sort of obscure issue about Trump's charity and taxes. Okay, it's important to understand the context. I'm going to tell you why in a second. Trump would get a lot. He owns like a box at where the Mets play. He owns a box where they do the U.S. Open tennis tournament, and so he would sell the box as tickets to a guy who was like a high-end ticket broker. And Trump would say, okay, well, don't pay me. You owe me $450,000 or whatever for this year. Don't pay me. Pay my foundation instead. So that we're trying to figure out why this random ticket broker was giving huge amounts of money to Trump's foundation. That was the answer. And that's fine, but by tax law, you have to pay income taxes on that. Trump has to pay income taxes on that. If he had income and then assigned that it said, don't pay me, pay my charity, that's still money that he controls, so he has to pay income taxes on it. So I called the Trump people and said, hey, did Trump pay income taxes on this money? It's a lot of money. It's like over $1 million over a few years. And normally they didn't call me back at all. But this day they had Boris Epstein call me. And he said, well, you should know that Donald Trump in all of these interactions follows the dictates of a 1927 Supreme Court decision, IRS Commissioner versus Rossetti. And this is a completely, you have to be a tax law professor to even know that existed. And that Donald Trump says, okay, you owe me $35,000. I forgive your debt. You don't have to pay me anything. But hey, if you'd like to give some money to some charity somewhere, go ahead. And it just happened that every time the people took the exact amount of money they owed him and gave it to his charity, nobody else. In that context, he wouldn't have to pay income taxes. And I said, well, is that the case every time? Donald Trump has never said, take the money you owe me, put it in his charity. And Boris said this thing that is, you love to hear this as a journalist. He said, prove me wrong. And it happened that because I knew Trump's charitable giving really well, I could. I said, well, what about this? There was a case where he did a roast on Comedy Central, and they owed him $400,000. And he said at the time, could give the money to my charity. Boris says, oh yeah, in that case, he paid income taxes. Prove me wrong again. So the ability to have immersed myself in that so much that I knew more about it than the people they were calling to basically have lie to me, was such a huge advantage in those interviews because you didn't have them very long. And the point was never going to be the information they gave you. It was going to be catching them in a falsehood. And I felt, well prepared in those instances to be ready to do it. And I think having dealt with people yelling at me in the past, I wasn't going to get in a fight with them. It was much more satisfying, actually, to prove them wrong.
And so how do you sort of adjust your language in pushing back? How do you sort of read that situation and know how far you want to go and when to dial back?
Well, I mean, to me, the thing that makes people the maddest and is the most effective is to be polite to them, to always to be as congenial and as nice as you can. Deb Nelson, who was a reporter of the Seattle Times when I was an intern there, gave this great interviewing seminar that I went that is still the only formal training I ever had in interviewing, in which she said, if people are going to lie. Let them tell the whole lie first. If people are telling you something that's incorrect, don't stop them in the middle and cut them off and say, wait, I know you're lying. Let them tell the whole lie, and then come back and sort of gently unravel it. And so that's what I was always trying to do in these cases, is let them tell the whole thing, and then come back and sort of, in a nice way, walk them through the ways that they were wrong. Yeah. I think you don't want to get people, so many people want an argument, and especially the Trump people their whole MO is that they can break the rules, but we can't. They can break the rules against decorum, against arguing, against telling falsehoods, and we can't. They want to pull you into something where you're in the same level as them, and to have the preparation and training not to do that, I think is the most effective and makes them extremely mad.
Yeah. I mean, especially I think a lot of reporting now, right? It's not like you have to go down to the courthouse, sort through all these records, go chase somebody. A lot of it is digital, a lot of it is on the phone. How has that changed your approach to things?
So for me, the challenge has been organizing information. How do I organize my own information? Because covering Trump is like covering a lot of secretive organizations. They're not going to give you a roadmap to how they operate. They're not going to give you documents that show their internal workings. And so a lot of the time is you reverse engineering how they work. And so the key for me has been to try to make sure that I can store information that I find it again easily, and that it's searchable for me. So if I've completely forgotten about it, I can find it again and know where it might be. And so I've used a lot of Google spreadsheets. I should be doing something more than Microsoft Word, but I'm not. I'm using a lot of Microsoft Word documents, but going back and making sure that I'm spelling everything right. I'm including the dates and phone numbers, making notes for myself. For a long time, I covered politics, and I would do spend 2 weeks on a feature about Ted Cruz. While I'm working on that feature about Ted Cruz, it's all I'm writing the notes down, obviously, but it's all kind of in my head. The organizational connections, the people's relationships to one another, the structure of the story is all kind of in my head. I write the story, I forget about Ted Cruz, I got to write about Marco Rubio. Trump was so different than that, and then I would learn something today, and then 3 weeks from now, I would learn more about the law and learn, well, hey, that thing I learned 3 weeks ago, that was illegal. I need to go back and write more about that. Can I find that thing? Can I remember who I talked to about it? Organizing my own notes over about a lot of complicated things, like making maps, not literal maps usually, but making a map of a business, making a map of a client base, making a map of donations, and then having that map be useful to me 6 months later. That's been the big challenge for me.
And so has that really paid off? Because you're still chasing this story. I mean, how do you know how far the story goes?
I mean, I try not to think about it like that because I don't know. So I'm covering the Trump business now, the golf courses, Mar-a-Lago, the hotels, to try to understand who those customers are and to how customer base is changing. the great example of like how you don't know how things are going to change was this thing with Mar-a-Lago over the summer. So we had spent in the spring written a story about how all these sort of fancy galas that come to Mar-a-Lago, which ones were coming this year. No one had ever kind of made a database of which charities came to Mar-a-Lago, because they pay Trump a lot of money. I mean, he could make like $300,000, $275,000 off one gala, one night. $275,000 will come into Mar-a-Lago.
And
so
how did you figure all this out?
That's in the IRS filings, thankfully. The IRS Form 990s are wonderful for those covering charity. So I wanted to make just a list of who his customers were. And at the time, I wrote a story about it at the time that his customer base had declined a little bit, but mostly he was doing pretty well. And I didn't know what that list was going to be useful for, but I knew it was going to be useful. And it wasn't something it's something I had to create. It didn't exist anywhere else. And so this summer after Charlottesville, when people start bailing out on one charity after another starts bailing out on Mar-a-Lago, now I have a list of who was there, and I can help people and I can help myself figure out who's left. I think that story was very different because we had a list of who was going to come there rather than just sort of ticking off the charities without knowing who was next. I think a lot of charities felt pressure from their supporters, from their donors, because we had already figured out who was going to be there. And that story changed a lot because we weren't dependent on Trump to tell us who his clients were.
And so how do you go about it? I mean, it's not necessarily something everybody wants to talk to you about. How do you go and get people to talk to you?
Well, you have to accept in some cases that not everyone's going to want to talk about it. In a lot of these charities, no commented. And so in some cases, I've tried to find ways around that by going to their boards. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. But to me, the key has been volume, right? I'm never putting myself in a position where I'm dependent on one person. I'm waiting on one person to tell me what the story is, or one person that I'm like, if they say no or they don't cooperate, the story falls apart. I try to have enough knowledge that I'm not writing about one thing. And so you can have pleasant surprises, and the story might get better, but you're not going to ever put all your eggs in one basket, and then the basket goes away. Writing about Trump's charitable giving, we've tried to just cast as wide a net as possible. One of the things we're doing now is trying to figure out which sports teams that have stayed at Trump's hotels in the past are coming back to stay with them now. And so, there's been some teams that have said no comment, and we can't talk about it. And then you come back to them and say, look, everybody else in your league has answered this question except for you. And then sometimes they're a little more cooperative. But having that ability where you're not dependent on any one person to make or break the story, I think gives you a lot of power.
Yeah. So what was the most surprising thing that you felt like you learned about reporting?
To me, the most surprising thing was how incredibly useful Twitter followers could be. And Twitter, the things that people knew. Because we think of ourselves as like, maybe I should speak for myself. I thought of myself as like a trained journalist. Like I can find things, that nobody's safe from me. I can find people's names. I can find people's addresses. I am an experienced digger of facts. But actually, I only know the systems that I've worked in, right? I was a cops reporter for a while, so I sort of understand criminal justice systems, how to find people in those systems. Although I cover the DC police, it's totally different than the police department in other places, so I don't actually know that much. I understand how to search in some contexts, but there's so much context that I don't have. And so things that just seemed impossible to me were not impossible. I just didn't know where to start looking. One great example of this was last year, I was writing about trying to figure out the answer to one of the weirdest donations in the history of the Trump Foundation, which I found in an IRS document. Okay, so Trump had given, in 1989, he'd given a $7 grant from his foundation to the Boy Scouts. The Boy Scouts of America got $7. And that's a story, right? There's something weird there, but like, I don't know what the first step is. The Boy Scouts won't talk to me, Trump won't talk to me. It's 20-something years ago. Like, I was like, well, do I try to reconstitute who was in the same Boy Scout troop as Don Jr.? Like, what's the next step? It's like just there's no path. And so I just kind of gave up on that story and thought, well, this is lost. Like, I have discovered a fact that has drifted in the midst of history no one's ever going to know, or no one's ever going to tell me. I just put it out on Twitter. Like, isn't this weird? It must be a funny story. I don't know what it is. And my Twitter followers took that as a challenge. They started all kinds of ideas. And really, it was amazed to watch people who presumably were not waiting for me to ask them about the Boy Scouts on a donation 20-something years ago, taking time out of their lives to say, well, what's the answer to this question? I talk about people liking the hunt. People really wanted to be part of this. And so they were like, well, could it have been popcorn? The Boy Scouts sell terrible popcorn. I don't know if they still do, but we did.
They still do.
It's awful. There was not even caramel. It's just stale popcorn in a can that your mother buys and throws away. So the popcorn company is on Twitter, believe it or not, and still selling crappy popcorn. So people are like, hey, at Trails End Popcorn, how much did a tin of popcorn cost in 1989? And Trails End Popcorn, there's some social media intern there. It's like, oh my God, you know, what's going on? And they respond right away to say, no, in 1989, a tin of popcorn cost $5. Okay, so it's not the same thing. And so then people start searching old, which I would never have thought to do this. Start searching old newspaper clips. Like I would have thought to look for the clips, but people found a way that Google has digitized the ads, you know, not just the stories of the Schenectady Tribune from 1989, but the ads. And so one of the ads that somebody found from someplace in upstate New York in 1989 was, have your son join the Boy Scouts this fall. The registration for the year is only $7. So there it is. Like, I mean, Trump still won't confirm it, so I don't know it for sure, but it appears that a man who had just written a book about how rich he was using a charity's money to pay his son's entrance fee in the Boy Scouts. But that's one of many things where I just didn't know what the first step was until somebody, you know, some stranger showed it to me.
And so do you ever worry, though, that our competition is out there looking at your great community and trying to take the scoop from you?
Yes, certainly. And I think about that a couple of different ways. One, usually when I've done this, it's because I'm asking for something that I have no other way of getting. You know, like in the Boy Scout thing, like, you know, I had lost all hope that I would find that. It wasn't like, I thought I was making progress. I had lost all hope. So I was just like, well, you know, it's this or nothing. So I might as well try it. Also, like, I don't know, I have taken a different view of competition now in this digital age. I still hate the New York Times and want to beat them at all times, but I feel like there's so much to be gained by having more than one person chasing a story. I mean, I think we saw that last week with the Politico story that started on Tom Price's private jets. There was a huge amount of work that the political people put in to figuring that out in the beginning, and which they've been justly praised for. But after they sort of figured that out, the story benefited by having us in the New York Times and everybody else trying to figure out, you know, now that someone's established the pattern, where else is it happening? And I think in that situation, we're not losing readers. Politico didn't lose readers because other people got in the story. I think we're all sort of advancing the same story. So I don't take as dim a view of competition as I used to, again, with the caveat that I hate the New York Times.
Glad we made it official. But also, too, one of these things is, I mean, you open Twitter up to a bunch of internet people, or people supposedly, right? I mean, how do you go about verifying things, right? And how do you make sure, how you have to verify like almost your tipsters, even maybe your most famous tipster with the Access Hollywood tape, right?
Well, I mean, the key to me has been that you have to make yourself the filter between everything that comes in. If you try to crowdsource things, you try to ask people for help, everything has to go through me before it comes out the other side, as a tweet, as a story. You know, both because you don't want to be hoaxed, but also because you're dealing with a lot of people who they want to help, but they're not like us. They haven't been trained in libel. They haven't had the experience of trying to find one guy named David Fahrenthold and realizing that there's actually, which is true, like 5 people named David Fahrenthold in the world. There's a lot of people by the same name. So they've never been through the experiences we have that makes them cautious about jumping to conclusions. So you have to always, even if they're in good faith, you have to make sure that you check out the conclusions they gave you. And so, you know, at the Post, that's meant like sending out freelancers. If somebody says, I found X thing, sending a freelancer to go see if we can put eyes on the same thing. Trying to find ways in documents, always verifying the things that come in. I mean, the tips are, invaluable. There's some things you would never find out about if you hadn't asked for help from the world. But you have to make sure you verify it. One good example of this was we had this whole search last year for this portrait that Donald Trump had bought of himself for $20,000. And I take it back. He bought 2 portraits, one for $20,000 and one for $10,000 of himself with the money from his charity. And so one of them, the $10,000 one, I was looking for, and I had no idea where it was. I knew he'd bought it just in 2014. I knew he'd spent his charity's money. I needed to know where it was because the law says that if you buy something with your charity's money, you have to use it for a charitable purpose. You can't just hang it on the wall of your house, and so, even if your name is on the charity. And so I needed to know where this portrait was because it could be that he'd broken the law by buying it and then using it for a non-charitable purpose. So I'm stuck, though. I have a picture of what the portrait looks like. I have no idea where it is. I'm starting to get the machinery going to send freelancers out to, all of the public Trump courses and hotels, but recognizing that a lot of them are private. So even if I sent people to all the places I could get somebody in, they still might not get somebody into the place where it was. And then a reader in Atlanta had the idea to go on TripAdvisor, to go looking at all the user-generated photos of Trump's resort at Doral. She decided that this was such an ugly portrait that he would not hang it in his home, that he would hang it where the public had to look at it. And so she decided Doral was one of his biggest resorts, so she would go through the user-generated photos. And after hundreds of pictures of the buffet and the hot buffet and the cold buffet and people's bathrooms and everything else, she got to a picture of this portrait hanging on the wall, the thing I was looking for hanging on the wall of the sports bar at the Doral Resort. And so she sent it to me. We call TripAdvisor. They verify it. They say, okay, this is a photo dated February 2016. So this is at this point, September of last year. So now I know where it was. I just need to know where it is. And so the plan had been that I was going to send a freelancer out the next morning. This was like 8 o'clock at night. The next morning to Doral to see if they could find it hanging on the wall. In the meantime, a guy named Enrique Acevedo, who is an anchor at Univision down in Miami, Spanish language TV network, he sees it. He sees my tweet saying, hey, wow, look, it might have been at Doral. And he recognizes that Doral is like 4 blocks away from him. So he finishes his newscast at midnight, makes a reservation with points, not with money, and makes it with points, goes to Doral, checks in, and then he arrives at like 12:30 at night, and so they're sort of closing up the place. It's like a Wednesday or something. And he convinces the cleaning crew to let him into the sports bar, which is now closed. And he finds it still hanging on the wall, takes a picture of it with himself. So that was wonderful. We went from absolutely no idea where in the world this thing was at 10 o'clock in the morning to 12:30 at night, here it is. Breaking the law. Here it is on the wall of a sports bar. But if that had been just a regular person who did that, not somebody who was a journalist for another news outlet, I think I still would have sent a freelancer. But because Enrique is, obviously another journalist, that was great. His word was good, and that was the proof we needed. So that was the kind of thing that I think, I'm trying to sort of make sure that I always, I never leave myself open to unverified information, even if it's coming from somebody who is acting in good faith.
Yeah. All right, well, I want to make sure we leave time for questions. So if you guys want to start coming up to these mics, if you have questions, we'll start in a little bit. But sort of while people are shuffling, I do have a question for you. So you started your career at the Post as an intern.
Yes.
Shameless plug, applications are due tomorrow.
Yes.
If anybody here is interested, you can talk to Dave all about his experience.
It's a great intern program.
What kind of thinking of where you are now, what do you sort of wish somebody had told you about reporting when you were a cub reporter?
That's a really good question. I would say 2 things. One is patience. And the hardest part for me about being a reporter, the reason I like being a reporter is because it requires such a short attention span, which I have. But the hardest part for me has been patience in interviewing, staying longer than it seems necessary, staying after you get the first good quote. And the thing that really sets great reporters apart, I have a lot of colleagues at the Post who are like this, Stephanie McCrum and Eli Saslow. People that get the great stories, they stay, they take a lot of people's time. They wait for people to really open up. And I've always had a hard time doing that, and I wish people had I've tried to learn by following other people's examples, but I wish that'd been more drilled into me. The other thing is, and this is not going to seem like a surprise to y'all, that reporters have to be project managers. There's so much of, when I started as a reporter, you could report and then block everybody out for a couple days and write. You could go to a coffee shop, not answer phone calls. The part of the process was just writing by shutting yourself off from the world. And that's just not possible now. So much of reporting is coordinating with video and photo and graphics and editors, making sure everybody's in the loop. And that makes the story better, it reaches more readers. That's a mindset that you have to get used to. I think college journalists get used to it now anyway. I think a lot of them are dealing with this same, a team of people working on a story even before they get into the professional world. But that's one thing I had really focused on when I was younger that I didn't. I had to sort of learn going along, and it's been a real adjustment for me.
How did you feel like you learned that? Or what was the thing that you think made that go smoothly?
Sometimes just when I drop the ball on things, sometimes I would sort of have this instinct still, okay, well, screw those people, I gotta write. Writing is what takes precedence. That's what I do. I'm gonna write. I'm not gonna answer their phone calls for 3 days. And then seeing what could have been a great story with a great, great display, it could have been something much better. Either seeing that not happen, or then having to wait a week while the various other parts of the paper were set into motion. So I've learned basically by failing, by doing it the hard way.
Awesome. All right, let's start over here. I don't know if that mic was on, so just to repeat the question was sort of about, you know, Dave seems always very prepped, but has there been an instance where you have not been so prepared?
Oh, sure. I mean, I tell you the stories in which I look good, so I wouldn't tell you the stories in which I look bad. Definitely, and those, you know, that's one of the things about politics. I covered Congress for a while. You were never sure when like a senator would emerge and you'd have to ask them questions about the bill, you know, or you'd have to ask them what was going on in a closed conference meeting. That was kind of a good training because you got used to knowing enough about policy to ask people the right question. And obviously, if you're talking to senators or congressmen, they would love to tell you something meaningless, right? They would love to talk to you for 5 minutes and say nothing. And so if you catch them in the hallway, you have to know exactly what you're asking for. So I failed a number of times to get the right answer from a senator or congressman. And that sort of led me to be more prepared about like really thinking hard about what the exact thing is I need to know. Those of you who've ever covered Congress, there's a scene when the House Republicans would have these meetings. They'd all go into this big conference room and close the doors. And so all the reporters would basically stake out the hallway outside where the bathroom was. And so you were at the mercy of whoever came out first to go to the bathroom. And so some random congressman, and they all kind of look alike, would all come out, and like because they had to go to the bathroom, they had planned poorly and drunk a lot of coffee. Now the 50 reporters would swarm around them and ask them about what was going on inside. So it helped to know both what you needed to ask and also to know who the hell these people were. There was sometimes actually we'd all interview somebody very intensely about whatever had just happened in a Republican conference meeting, and then at the end we'd realize that no one knew who this person was. They were just a guy in a suit wearing a pin, so probably they were a member of Congress. And then there were all kinds of artful ways to ask without quite asking, like, what district are you from? And then you could look up all the 17th districts. So that was an experience that really taught me to be prepared because I did it wrong a number of times.
I mean, there must have been some instances, too, where you sort of wait, you think you have it, you go back to your desk, and you're like, oh, no, there's this one thing. Totally. How do you usually handle the follow-up to those types of interviews? I
mean, that happens a lot. It happens often in the writing process, as you all know. Like, if you start writing and hit a hard spot, it's because you don't know enough. You know, you're trying to write around a hole in your knowledge. To me, those things are hard because sometimes if it's a senator or a congressman, it's hard to get them again. But to just basically turn off, at least for me, turn off the gene that stops you in normal life from like imposing on people. It makes you think, oh, this would be awkward. This would be imposing. As journalists, it's just a license to turn that off. Like call them back, even if it's taking all too much time, even if you're annoying them. You'd rather get things right. This is a sort of a related topic. Wes Lowry of the Post wrote this wonderful story 2 days ago about a man and a woman who were in the crowd in Las Vegas who had just met each other that day or maybe even that night, who were like from different parts of the country. They would sort of struck up a friendship, and they were with each other when the shooting began. And the woman died and the man lived, but he had like sheltered her, brought her to the hospital, and then this stranger became this point of contact for her family who was trying to figure out where she was and what had happened to her. This is an incredible story. And so Wes found the guy. I think he like knew somebody through Facebook who knew him. But then he interviewed him once and then sat down to write the story and then realized, okay, I don't have it all. I need to call him back. And so he spent 3 hours on the phone with this guy. Normally, everything about normal human interactions tells you not to take 3 hours of time from somebody who's mourning, who's just had this traumatic event, but that's the job in this situation is to you don't want to take 2 hours and leave some things, get some things wrong or leave some things out. To go back and go over things again and again and again and always try to get more detail. It's like sort of a politeness reaction you have to suppress, but it's important.
Yeah. Take this question.
I think a lot of people thought that the Access Hollywood tape would be kind of the nail in the coffin of the Trump campaign, and obviously it wasn't. So my question is, how do you kind of remain optimistic about the impact that your work and your reporting and like long hours of reporting is actually having on like a larger scale?
To me, it has not been that hard. I did not think that Access Hollywood, at the time, I thought it was a big deal, but I didn't think like, okay, I just finished off Donald Trump. He'd survived so much else, I didn't think that was going to be, it actually was more damaging to him than I thought it was going to be. But I feel like the thing I wanted to do last year was to tell people about who Donald Trump really was. You know, like he spent his whole life constructing this facade. I'm going to tell you about what he's really like. You know, how do you measure his actions rather than his words? And I felt like I did that, you know, and people take that in the voting booth with them, and, you know, but then they vote whoever they want to. And this year, I felt like the job that I really hope we're doing, I think we're doing a good job of it now as a newspaper and as an industry, is to do the same thing with Trump as president, to write about his actions, to write about what's really happening, you know, not to treat him as the brain of the administration if he's really just the mouth. You know, like to not take his words, not to focus so much on his words and miss what's really happening. I think we're doing a good job of that. So I'm naturally an optimistic person, and so I think that the appreciation you see for journalism now and the attention people are paying to our stories is a sign that we're having an impact. But I don't want to put myself in a position where somebody has to lose or somebody has to resign or somebody has to be impeached of whatever party for me to feel like I did what I was supposed to.
Go over here.
Hi, I'm Anna Huntsman. I'm a journalism major at Kent State, so I'm a student reporter, and a lot of times it's difficult to navigate the world of higher ed, and professors or administrators don't want to talk to a student, or you know, we broadcast to the county, and local government officials don't want to talk to a student. So I guess what advice do you have for students, or even just those starting out in their careers, on getting people to talk to you and I guess maintaining those connections?
Well, it is a really hard position. I mean, being a college reporter, yes, you're right. Everybody thinks they can basically wait you out, right? The administrators think they'll be longer than you are, and so if they just stonewall you for a while, then you'll be gone, and they'll continue on. And I have two pieces of advice. The first one is that if you come into those interviews prepared, if you come into those interviews knowing as much about whatever subject as they do, you can gain, if not respect, then at least fear. You want to be knowledgeable enough that they feel like they can't BS you, and I think that to me is the way that you start any relationship like that. You know, somebody who doesn't take you seriously, no matter where you are, basically if they're not going to be upfront with you, then you find ways of showing them that you can ignore them, right? Or you can work around them. They aren't the gatekeeper of whether you're successful or not. I think that's one thing, and then also. To try to show your audience, right? To try to show the power of having an audience. If you can reach an audience, if you can do some things that show students how you're being stonewalled, right? That you have the advantage of a platform, and if people aren't going to talk to you, find a way of making that obvious. Find a way of letting people know how long you've been stonewalled. I think that there's nothing more satisfying to me in journalism than finding people who think that they're too good for you, or think that they can get away with lying to you or keeping information secret, and basically forcing them to tell the truth. I think that you're in a great position because so many people are trying to stonewall you. You have a real target-rich environment, but it's hard. It's really hard, and it won't happen right away. Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is JD. I'm a senior at Boston University. In this past year, we've kind of seen this trend of big stories being published, all based on anonymous sources close to the Trump administration. Kind of became a source battle between the New York Times, Washington Post, who could have the most anonymous sources. What do you think about this? Do you think it's effective, and do you think we'll see it continue in this age of antitrust against the media and anonymous sources and anti-leak rhetoric by Trump?
It has been a really unusual time, and I don't cover the White House, so I'm speaking mostly as a reader here, not as somebody who's been doing this very much. But there's been a lot of great stories done by us in the New York Times and a lot of other people based on leaks from within the White House. I mean, there was a time sort of in February, March, April, where our stories would have we would cite the number of people we talked to within the West Wing, and it was more people than I thought worked in the West Wing. It was 30 people talked to us about this. And I think that was, anonymous sources are there. You'd rather not use them, but often you have to use them. And I think we did a good job in those cases talking to a whole bunch of them to try to bounce them off each other, and also to try to make clear to readers how many of them there were. And I think that's something that we really have tried to be more explicit about, because so many people are reading us sort of for the first time, or they're reading us regularly for the first time. They don't know that, in the old days we could say, sort of with the voice of God, White House sources said X, and just expect people to trust that we must have talked to enough to really know. Now you say, 30 White House sources. We'll spell out a little bit more how we know. The thing I think that I think we've been getting better at, but that I think was a bad trend, was there were times in which news outlets would run with something from one White House source, and often that this is a different White House. in previous White Houses, there was the idea that if somebody in the White House leaked, the White House believes X. That was like something being done in a coordinated way, and it was sort of it was a trial balloon. You know, the White House is leaking that they might do X because they really want to do X in a week, and they want to test out the reaction to it. So in some cases, printing, the White House is considering whatever based on an anonymous source. That was useful for us because you were showing people, giving people a guide to the actual future. But now, there's, I don't know how many people work in the White House, but every one of them is a competing agenda. Every one of them is often trying to leak something to the media to get it to Trump. They're trying to influence policy by leaking it. And so the fact that when they say they're considering it, maybe just one guy is considering it. So I think Bannon, just as a reader, I think Bannon did a lot of that when he was there. The White House is considering this. And then after a while, I think people got sort of wise to that. So then it became, Steve Bannon is considering this. Like, Steve Bannon's considering a 50% tax on the rich. Like, things that were just designed to position Steve Bannon as put him in some sort of a moral context. I think those stories are much less useful. The White House is considering X based on anonymous sources. I think they're a lot less useful than they used to be because it's not a great guide to the future. Much of the time, the White House is considering something that it never does, or that never really got considered in the way that you might expect. So we have to make a distinction. I think reporting things that have happened based on anonymous sources is necessary, although you have to be careful about sourcing it deeply. Reporting what the anonymous sources are thinking about, I think that's less useful, and hopefully we're going to do less of it.
Thank you.
All right.
Hi, I'm Jingnan Huo, a graduate from Northwestern University. Thanks for the talk. So you were talking about being satisfied that you caught your sources lying. So have you ever been in a situation in which you do not have enough information to determine whether your sources are lying, and you feel that your sources, or most of your sources, may have the incentive to not tell you the whole truth, and you have to rely on them? And in this case, how do you navigate that?
That was what a lot of covering Congress was like. That is a really hard part about covering politics, particularly. There's so many people who don't have an incentive to tell you the truth and will go on background and tell you something that's completely self-serving BS. I think in those situations, I try not to just, there's sometimes when you just don't know the story well enough to write it, and writing what people are telling you, if you don't trust it, is counterproductive. So I've always tried to think of ways to verify what you get from people, to use anonymous source, to use documents, to use, on-the-record sources, to try to verify things. And if you can't verify it and you don't believe sources are telling you the truth, and like when Carl Lewandowski told me that thing about Trump having given the $1 million, that was on the record, so it was fine to use. It's useful. If they're going to tell me something that's wrong on the record, that can be useful to print sometimes. But if you don't trust the on-background sources, just don't use it. A lot of times covering Congress, you spend a lot of time saying, this person who's speaking to me on background, I don't think they're telling me the truth. I'm not even going to mention it. I'm not, it's not useful to me to have like an anonymously sourced wrong thing.
Right.
Hi, David. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Rachel. I'm a senior at the University of Portland. And my question is, as an experienced digger of facts or an expert interviewer, considering our political landscape right now and diversity issues, how do you think your interviewing process will be different if you are a woman or a person of color?
That's a good question. So I think that I don't know for sure, but one of the things that I've been really surprised by, in a bad way, is and got to see a lot more during this campaign, was the different way that women and people of color are treated by readers, treated by people on Twitter. People often ask me, like, well, did you get a lot of harassment because you covered Trump? Did Trump trolls come after you? And the first answer is that the Bernie people were much worse than Trump's people ever were. I got much more shit from people from Bernie Sanders, from like one story about Bernie Sanders than anything that Trump people ever gave. And no, basically, like I had one death threat, and the guy called it in from his phone number in Milwaukee, so he was easy to find. But
one death threat is still.
It was still a death threat, but
Okay.
it was not a very. It was the best kind of death threat. But my colleagues like Jenna Johnson, Abby Phillip, people that were with Trump every day, that cover him every day now, the abuse that they get from people is, on social media, in person sometimes, over email, is just so much worse than what I experienced. And I guess I was not aware of that huge difference until this campaign. To talk about how I would do things differently, I wish I knew. I think I take for granted a lot of the advantages that I have because I've never had it any other way. So I don't know. That's a good question. I never thought about it, but I don't really know.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi. So one of the things as a reader I've really enjoyed is being able to follow the long thread and kind of come along with you. And because I'm also a journalist, I know what that takes. I'm wondering, sort of big picture, in the digital world, with the news cycle getting faster and faster every week, how at risk are we for losing the art of the follow-up story? And for you personally, how do you balance continuing to follow that thread while also being on the next thing?
Right. That's been a hard struggle for me. So last year I had the advantage of doing one thing, right? Doing only Trump charity. And this year, covering the golf courses and the Trump organization in Mar-a-Lago, it's been more, there's been more things happening at once, and I've definitely been less good about like keeping people up to date while I'm following these other things. To me, the first step has been to try not to spend all my days, which is hard, not just reading Twitter, like trying to keep up with everything else that Donald Trump is doing. I think it's a little easier now, but it was really hard in the beginning not to just spend all your time trying to figure out what was going on in the world, to focus on what I'm reporting and realize that my job is to tell people something new, not to read what everybody else is doing. And the second thing is to try to find like rituals of my day that remind me that that's part of my job, right? I still get trapped in this habit from years as a print reporter where like, okay, today I'm gonna make a whole bunch of phone calls. Today I'm gonna dig deep on this one thing. I'm gonna look at these documents. And when I imagine my day, I don't imagine a public-facing part of it, right? I don't have a story, so like in the old way of thinking, like I don't have anything to show the public. And to find ways of reminding myself to like to have some running conversation with the public on Twitter, to be thinking about what I could write that would update people about things that have already happened, to try to make that kind of like producing something for people to follow a part of every day. And I've gotten better at that, but I have not really mastered it. So there's sometimes like when all the charities were quitting Mar-a-Lago, that there was like an obvious thing that I could update people on all the time. And for me, I have to think about like my social media interaction as like, how do I tell people a story they can understand, and how can they see the change in it, right? Like, not only can you understand what I'm doing and what I'm looking for, but how can you see that your interaction is moving the story forward? What's the new thing on the page that shows you that we're doing something together? And it's been harder for me to figure that out for some of these things. I also had the advantage last year of feeling like before anybody knew who I was, I had like pushed that story to the limit I could with conventional reporting practices. So by the time that I was ready to sort of go out to the world and talk about what I was doing, I had reached my limit, and then I was like, okay, reader, I'm not going to insult you by asking for something that's obvious. I'm going to tell you that I've searched for all the obvious things, and now I need your help to find what goes beyond. And it's taken me a while on the new beat to feel like I'm in that place where I'm like, okay, now I know I'm the expert, but I need to ask your help for things that go beyond what I can find. And I'm getting in that place now, but for me, it's been a matter of, as I said, trying to reach a point where I can talk to the public intelligently and not ask them for things that are either hard to follow or obvious, and also to make that conversation part of my ritual every day, because it's so easy for me to slip back in the old habits. Thank you.
Great. Okay, I think we're running a little over, but maybe 2 more questions. We'll try to get these.
You talked earlier about the importance of knowing your stuff and trying to think what the other thing was, and being polite. But do you have a particular question line or even a style of question that you find works really well or even works really badly that you try to avoid?
Well, I think that when I'm doing a big interview, I know a big interview is coming, like everybody else, I write down questions ahead of time and sort of like think of a rhythm in the questions to go from general to specific. But to me, the thing that I think is most effective, and I have an incredibly hard time doing it, is being quiet, like not responding right away. I have a tendency to fill dead air in personal life and in stories, and you can't do that. You have to stop yourself, and it's painful for me sometimes because people will fill it. They'll fill it in with something that they didn't tell you the first time, right? There's a natural human instinct to fill the air and also to make sense of things that don't really make sense. So if they've given you their BS answer and you sit there for a second quietly, they might tell you the real answer. Favorite question? No, not one that's far enough, that's widely enough applicable. a brief story, then I'll answer the last question. When I was in college at the student newspaper, I interviewed with this other guy. We'd go interview the president every month, and it was a horrible job because he would just drone on and say nothing useful. But he had this habit where he would say a whole sentence, and you needed to get the last word of the sentence to know what the hell he was talking about. He would have a long sentence about diversity and the student body and da-da-da-da-da, and then he would say, all that is, and then he would stop. And like, you needed to know what that is. He would, horrible, good, great, whatever. And my co-writer was so upset by the idea of dead air that he would fill it in. He'd be like, great, and the president would be like, it's great, that's right. So then we just spent 5 minutes tape recording this thing that was a sentence without an end. So I always think of that co-writer and try to stop myself from filling in when I should be letting the sources talk.
All right, last question over here.
Hi. I hope you will stay with me for 1 second. I just wanted to say that I'm with the Fund for Investigative Journalism and the Schuster Institute for Investigative Journalism are offering fellowships right now to encourage diverse reporting. So if you go to either of our websites, you can see what the application
That's great.
involves. My name is Florence Graves, and I'm the founding director of the Schuster Institute for Investigative Journalism, which is based at Brandeis. And I have a question for you. I know you were at the Post started in 2000, and now it's 17, almost 2018.
17 years.
And in those years, it went from not as much money to what? Jeff Bezos has come in. I mean, it's a whole different world, I would think. I was at the Post briefly in '92 for a big story. What's it like now? And, you know, there's also a big concern, or was a concern, that he was going to be, I mean, he's already taking over the world in terms of products, et cetera. Does he have any influence at the Post in terms of what's reported, to your knowledge? And also, what are the resources like now? I mean, it must be heaven. It
is. I mean, it's really amazing. You know, I started the Post in 2000 when we were making tons and tons of money off the print product. We had people, you know, we had so many people. We covered so much of the world. And then all these very lean years where, you know, like everybody else, digital advertising went away, and we didn't have a national print audience the way the Times does, so we were trying to figure out how to adapt to that. Basically, I just got lucky in terms of timing. And I arrived at a time when we were hiring everybody. And then I stayed through a time when they were buying out a lot of the people who were older and made more money. I was sort of younger and cheaper and was not worth buying out. And so I stayed there long enough to then, I thought basically the place would eventually just, you know, close up and I'd go get another job. And then to get bought by Jeff Bezos, who's pumped so much money in and has brought so much digital ambition and just ambition generally, ambition for an audience. It's great in a lot of ways. We have a lot more people. We have a lot more ambition to serve the entire world. And there's also there's a lot of ideas about the way to present news digitally that we just didn't have before. You know, we struggled to figure out a digital strategy, and I don't understand much of it, but I know it's working. Megan probably does. But I know it's working and reaching an audience bigger than we had. In terms of what influence Bezos has had on the coverage, as far as I can tell, none. We had a meeting with him after Trump won. We were like, the politics staff, you know, you get like 15 minutes of his time, which is a lot of money and a lot of time. So the politics staff had our 15 minutes of meeting. And so Liza talked a lot of the time. And then at the end, somebody asked Bezos, you know, the government does a lot of business with Amazon Web Services. You know, Amazon government has a lot of power to regulate Amazon. Are you worried about Trump coming after you? Because Trump had made some noise about, you know, going after Amazon. And Bezos said, no, you know, I can take care of myself. You guys do what you were going to do anyway. You know, do the best job you can, which is the best possible answer you could have hoped for from somebody like that. Who's, you know, he bought us having never owned a newspaper before. We had the Graham family who'd owned newspapers, you know, for decades, and then Bezos had, you know, owned a web retailer. He never owned anything like a newspaper, and so to have him come in and understand that and to take so much pride, I think, in being part of that tradition is wonderful. It's the best you could have hoped for.
So the resources, I mean, what's the difference in how you were able to report before and after?
I mean, the best difference for me would have been like the 2012 election. When I was in the 2012 election, I was part of our political coverage. There weren't that many people. So we were covering, you know, people were covering candidates. You were writing a story every day. There was no time to be proactive. You were always reactive because there was so much happening. We had to just get in the paper. And to have the change now where there were so many other people last year who were covering the candidates day to day, who were writing about all these other things, that they could free up a guy to write about one candidate's charitable giving just because they thought it was a good story. That would have been impossible in 2012. And the resources were the direct reason I could do that. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. Really
Thank you.
appreciate it. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.